Environmental sustainability and justice is our topic. I think at the idea of environmental sustainability is a very important and central concept and reality that really is a good way to frame our relationship to the natural environment and moral considerations of justice and other moral considerations uh, can be framed in terms of the basic idea of environmental sustainability. And environmental sustainability refers to the carrying capacity of the natural environment, the carrying capacity of the biosphere. That is, the biosphere is not infinite. It does not have infinite resources. It does not cannot sustain infinite human and other forms of activity without um, without destruction. And so environmental sustainability refers to the capacity of the natural environment to sustain mainly human activity as our numbers have grown to over 7 billion on the planet, and our activity in the biosphere has reached a very significant level, pushing the boundaries or the limits of the natural environment. So environmental sustainability refers to the idea of staying human beings, and it's anthropocentric. That is, it is human-centered. The idea of human activity staying within the planetary boundaries, the limits of the biosphere over time. It doesn't neglect economic activity and economic development. Environmental sustainability calls for economic development staying within the carrying capacity of the environment. That is economic activity that is sustainable over time, over many generations of human beings. What the problem of environmental sustainability is relatively new. For most of human history, the population and economic activity was very low and staying clearly within the boundaries of the biosphere. It's with the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the beginning in the early 19th century, mainly in the middle of the 19th century to the present, and a huge increase in economic development and activity, and thereby resource consumption as well as pollution has been the result, pressing against the boundaries of the biosphere. And that includes the challenge of climate change, that the use of fossil fuels, carbon and other heat trapping gases have been emitted into the environment, which is now warming the biosphere. So the climate around the world is changing, and there is prediction that we might exceed, in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, might exceed the carrying capacity of the biosphere and have a very and possibly catastrophic warming of the planet. So environmental sustainability, in a nutshell, is a very important umbrella kind of concept for thinking about the environment, sustaining the natural environment and human and other activity within that environment. Now, based upon the idea of environmental sustainability, there are two basic strands or streams of thought pertaining to environmental justice. One can be called environmental justice, and that has to do with the benefits and burdens of the distribution of harming, exceeding the limits of the natural environment. So environmental justice is human-centered, it's anthropocentric, it pertains to human beings, and the fair distribution, it's a distributive justice question, the fair distribution of the harm, benefits, and burdens of environmental decay and pollution. The second strand, and it has to do with environmental ethics, and that is biocentric or ecocentric. It has to do with considerations of extending moral consideration beyond human beings to include non-human beings as well as their natural habitats. So a consideration, an ecologically centered moral consideration of not only human beings, but all living things on the planet. So let me briefly summarize the first strand of environmental justice. Exceeding the limits of sustainability results in the distribution of harm, the distribution of burdens on human populations, and also the benefits of exceeding sustainability. There are certain benefits to certain people. For example, the fossil fuel industry is benefited by exceeding the limits of sustainability. So environmental justice is grounded in the empirical claim or fact that the harm done to human beings due to exceeding the limits of sustainability is unequal. That is, the distribution of harm is disproportionate. There's a disproportionate distribution of the harm in terms of both social class and race. And those are interconnected. There's an intersection between social class, that is wealth status, and racial identity. And we see this historically, that poorer neighborhoods tend to be more polluted than richer neighborhoods. There's governmental decisions that favor the wealthy over the poor in terms of the distribution of pollution, the distribution of harm in the human population. Within the United States, as well as across the world, there's a disproportionate distribution of the harm done by exceeding the limits of sustainability. So there is a significant environmental inequality in terms of the distribution of harm. And that distribution occurs across race and social class. And that gives rise to the question of distributive justice. As we've discussed, distributive justice, especially in the realm of the distribution of social and economic goods. In this case, environmental sustainability is a fundamental good, a fundamental public social good, and harm as a fundamental, or excuse me, environmental pollution as a fundamental harm or wrong or bad. And so the distribution of environmental harm, environmental pollution, et cetera, including greenhouse gas emissions, falls under the rubric of distributive justice, in the sense that that good should be distributed in terms of fairness, the fairness of intrinsic value, impartiality, and reciprocity that we discussed, as well as perhaps applying the various theories of distributive justice that we've discussed to the distribution of environmental harm, as well as sustainability as a good. As we'll see in terms of justice, environmental justice also depends on the coherence, the proper relationship between the functioning of human beings and the natural systems, the natural environmental systems that support human activity. So the environmental justice has to do with the fair, the equitable distribution of sustainability as a basic good, as well, which includes the fair distribution of the harm, of the burdens of environmental pollution. So it also involves procedural justice in that everyone should be party to the deliberation that determines what constitutes a fair distribution. So that's referred to as procedural justice, and it's a democratic principle which says that everyone should, all citizens should have a voice in the determination of the equitable distribution of environmental good and harm, as well as recognizing the cultural heritage of the various citizen groups in the society. So that's a very quick and brief overview of the idea of environmental justice. It's grounded in environmental inequality, a disproportionate distribution in terms of social class and race, and therefore it calls for distributive justice of environmental sustainability in terms of fairness. The second stream has to do with environmental ethics, and that on the one side of environmental justice, we were exclusively concerned with the well-being of human beings. In the second strand of environmental ethics, we're also concerned with the well-being of non-human beings. And there's been a concerted effort to justify the moral standing of non-human beings in thinking about environmental ethics. That is to extend moral consideration, moral concern, not only to all human beings, but also to non-human beings, in particular sentient beings, beings who are conscious, who are capable of the conscious experience of suffering, as well as conscious experience of well-being. And this entails the expansion of the criteria of fairness to include non-human beings, primarily the idea that we should view non-human beings as possessing intrinsic value. That is, that non-human beings also have an inherent value to them. They have a life of their own. They have their own interests, and therefore we should consider them as having an intrinsic value as opposed to just having an instrumental value, that is, seeing them only as a means to human ends, but also bestowing on them and perceiving them as having their own ends and their own moral standing as beings on this planet. And therefore, some versions of impartiality and reciprocity apply to non-human beings as well. That is the idea of fair treatment of non-human beings, in particular sentient non-human beings, are also fall under the consideration of fairness. This includes our cats and dogs. All sentient non-human beings have an intrinsic value from this perspective, and therefore they are morally considerable. That when we make decisions about distributive justice or make policy decisions relating to the environment, we should also consider the well-being of non-human beings as well. So environmental ethics is grounded in the idea of extending moral consideration to non-human beings. Some argue for all living things. Others argue for extending it to sentient, that is conscious, non-human beings. Also, environmental ethics and distributive justice, both, and we have an overlap here between them, they involve future generations, the moral consideration of future generations. That is, the idea of environmental sustainability not only applies to current living beings, human and non-human, but it also potentially extends to consider the moral consideration of future generations, your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren, your great-great-great-grandchildren, etc. So, and this is referred to as intergenerational justice, a consideration of intergenerational or transgenerational justice, the moral consideration of human beings and other non-human beings. It's a question of whether we have duties, obligations to future generations. Do we have moral duties to human beings who do not yet exist? And this is tricky, right? Because they don't yet exist. But we could argue that we do have moral duty to future generations. We have a duty to leave them a sustainable natural environment so that they can live out their lives in a good way, have a decent life, and not inherit a polluted, degraded, disease-infected natural environment. In the end, both environmental justice and environmental ethics and consideration of future generations perhaps require a reframing of our basic common sense beliefs, a fundamental shift perhaps in our values, a fundamental shift perhaps in the way we view the world and our priorities and values within that world, to expand our moral consideration to other living things as well as future generations, and to live within what would it take to live within the carrying capacity of the natural environment? What values or beliefs would we need to shift in order to have a environmentally sustainable world? So those are some of the basic considerations in pertaining to environmental justice.